The OG DMG-01, the original Game Boy. Yes, this one is strictly monochrome, none of that colour nonsense here. I'm going to be taking a look at a few of the games that pushed it to the limit, and just to heat things up a bit, I'm going to try and look out for things that its console cousin, the NES, couldn't do, or at least would struggle to do without some extra help. And if we get lucky, we might even see some things that the Master System and Game Gear would have a hard time with too. And well, yes, alright, it's all black and white and won't ever look as pretty as other consoles in that way, but we'll see some tricks with pixels that were hard to match. So let's start with Operation C from 1991. A very solid entry in the Contra series, not a conversion as such, but a game that drew heavily from the NES's Super Contra. An excellent variation on the theme with that classic Konami era level of quality and excellence. Yes, it seems like developers hit the ground running with the Game Boy. Great limit pushing games springing up very early in its lifespan. Maybe to be expected though, the Game Boy had some unique features, but it was at its heart an 8-bit game system, not a million miles away from popular systems already out there. By the time of its release, many developers, not least Konami, were already well adept at knocking out top-notch 8-bit games. The Game Boy, typical for the time, had tile-based graphics, ideal for 2D games. Its graphics were made up of predefined blocks of pixels stored in the memory. We can see the tiles that go into making this first level of Operation C here. If this isn't your first retro game graphics rodeo, you might notice something interesting happening, but more of that in a moment. The NES had a similar tile-based system, that's true, but the Game Boy could do some things with tiles that the NES couldn't. Some big differences in its graphics architecture allowed it to pull off feats that were very difficult or maybe even impossible on its home console stablemate. Significantly, the Game Boy stored all of its graphics data in RAM mapped to the CPU address space, which in short allowed for easier manipulation of what was happening on the screen using the CPU's computing power. This shifting, misty, watery animated background seen here on the first level is possible because of this. If we go back to the tiles that are used to make up the graphics, we can see that a number of them are constantly changing, giving the animation effect. Because it's stored in easily accessible RAM, the game's code can change these background tiles even when other things are happening on the screen. It's not a huge detail, but this is something the NES had a hard time with. Okay, you can probably think of games on the NES that did things like this, but they all required some extra circuitry in the cartridge to make it happen, unlike the Game Boy, which could do it by default. One thing that limited both these systems, and well, pretty much all 8-bit systems, was the number of sprites or number of moving objects they could handle at any given moment. This made drawing those essential huge bosses a bit of a pain. They would just become a flickery mess if they got too large and there was too much happening on the screen. A way around this was to use background graphics to draw these huge entities. The only drawback to this was they couldn't move independently of the stuff around them, leading to a lot of 8-bit games ending with giant bosses floating in black voids, so as not to ruin the illusion. The Game Boy though had a handy feature that helped with this problem quite a bit, an extra background layer. Yes, it had enough space in its video memory for 2 separate tile-based backgrounds that could be switched between easily, even in the middle of drawing the screen. It could also use the other layer as what was called the window layer, allowing both backgrounds to be on the same part of the screen at once, with some restrictions. Designed for drawing things like status windows, this was not as sophisticated as the multi-layer background you might get on 16-bit consoles. There was no transparency, you could never see the other layer underneath, and the window couldn't be scrolled either. But you could put it anywhere on the screen anytime and even split it into different sections, and developers found all sorts of uses for it. This game in fact uses layer manipulation for a number of effects throughout, often quite subtly. This fantastic boss battle at the end of stage 1 is made possible by rapidly switching between the 2 backgrounds mid-frame, allowing the submarine at the bottom to move around and menace the player. It's even able to move independently of the water layer emerging from the waves. This elevator on stage 1 is created by drawing it with the window layer, the moving platform pasted onto the screen over the rest of the scrolling background. And this tank mini-boss does something similar, but the other way around. Effectively just one small corner of the screen is scrolling whilst the rest is pasted on by the window layer. Could the NES do stuff like this? Well, not exactly. It was very much restricted to one background layer. The screen could be split into sections that could move independently, but only horizontally, and even then with more limitations than the Game Boy. Effects that require graphics to be split up into vertical sections like the elevator would be really hard to recreate on the NES, and I think it would be a bit of a trial on the Master System too, it also being limited to one layer. Okay then, let's press on into something that, well, somehow manages to push the Game Boy's limits and also make them painfully obvious at the same time. Oh dear, it's one of those names. Chikyu Kaiho Gun Zas. Oh dear, yeah, probably just Zas for short will have to suffice. A vertically scrolling shooter, one of, well, not that many on the Game Boy. Fairly typical of the genre, it doesn't throw up a lot of surprises, but it is actually a pretty fine game and also pretty rare, with prices to match. But for those with a technical eye, there might be something pretty striking about this right away. Yes, it seems like we've got parallax scrolling, vertical too, the hardest kind to fake, and what looks to be transparency. But this can't be possible on the Game Boy, I don't think it's possible on any 8-bit system. Yes, we've established that there are two background layers, but as I said, only one of them can be scrolled and there is absolutely no transparency. So how can this be done? I've got to admit, the first time I saw this, it had me stumped. But it is a trick, a clever one though, and slowing the game right down will reveal exactly what is going on. Yes, the game is switching between two entirely separate screens every other frame, both scrolling independently of each other and relying on the blurry nature of the Game Boy display to smush them together. Whilst the Game Boy's video chip could output graphics at 60 frames per second, its LCD screen couldn't actually update the images that fast, and inevitably what was happening on one frame would bleed into the next. Of course, with most games this was nothing more than an annoying glitch, but the creators of Zas turned it into a feature. Other display technologies, even up to the present day, can have this tendency, but nowhere near as bad usually. I'm afraid this technique really doesn't work all that well on anything other than the original Game Boy line, unless you fake it with emulation. This is how it looks on the Super NES's Super Game Boy. Yeah, it's not quite the same, is it? This probably explains why no other games that I've been able to find do anything similar, despite it looking pretty good when it does work. On level 3, it's jazzed up even more by making one of the backgrounds animate, using a trick pretty common in 8-bit systems to scroll different parts of the screen at different rates as it's being drawn, creating a sort of liquidy effect that, well, looks pretty good. Of course, this won't work on the NES or any home system for that matter. Even old CRT displays were never quite so smeary. And display problems aside, I'm also not sure it would be easy on the NES to flick between two separate screens so quickly either. But let's move on once again to an entirely different sort of game that requires an entirely different sort of magic to make it work. It's Faceball 2000. A port to the Game Boy of the truly groundbreaking MIDI Maze, perhaps the first true first-person shooter that first appeared on the Atari ST. I've spoken about this game before in a video I'll link to right about now, but well, it's a good one, complete with multiplayer deathmatch modes and a large single-player campaign. Not bad for 1991 when this was released. But let's look into it more technically, shall we, because this does some pretty special stuff. Yes, the frame rate and draw distance is low enough for the modern PC master race to declare it a humanitarian crisis and demand UN intervention, but it's still quite playable if you're a bit more retro-minded, and a 3D raycasting engine on a system like this, well, that's an astonishing achievement. But as I've said, the Game Boy is a tile-based system, and if you've seen my previous limit pushing videos, you'll have probably already heard me explaining that this sort of game really shouldn't work well with tile-based graphics. When you're dealing with 3D scenes like this, you just can't build up images out of predefined tiles and have it look any good. You just don't have enough of them to create every possible combination of pixels that you'd need. But with the Game Boy, because of the way its graphics work, this is not so much of a problem. As we've already discovered, the Game Boy's graphics are stored in RAM that is accessible to the CPU directly, allowing the data to be easily manipulated and updated. On top of that, the Game Boy has enough graphics memory to allow all of the screen, just about, to have its own unique tile. Put these two things together with some clever coding and you've got a bitmap display. You can draw any combination of pixels you like anywhere on the screen without having to worry about how you're going to stitch it together out of a set number of tiles. Let's take a look at the tile memory in Faceball 2000 like we did in Operation C at the top of the video. There we saw a few tiles changing in a repeating pattern, but here it's near enough a screen's worth of graphics constantly being updated. The way it's shown here makes it a bit hard to make out, but you can probably see how the display is constructed out of these elements. If we slow things right down, we can even see the tiles being drawn individually and the screen being updated line by line. Now this is not a quick process, hence the low frame rate. Not only has the CPU got to do all the 3D calculations required as well as run the rest of the game logic, it's also got to draw it all too. The actual graphics are created in a buffer in the Game Boy's internal work RAM before being copied to the video memory. You can see that it only seems to be doing about a third of the screen in one go, having to wait until the next frame before it continues filling the screen, the Game Boy unable to do this any faster. Now the Game Gear at least could definitely do this, because this very same game appeared there running very nicely. But what about the NES? Well, maybe with some extra RAM in the cartridge, but as far as I'm aware, no one has ever managed to get anything more than a tech demo running. But let's come back to that and look at another game first. It's X. Just X. That's what it's called, an uncharacteristically short name for this Japanese exclusive. Released as a Nintendo first-party title, it's a big departure from anything else on the Game Boy. A space shooter that looks a bit like the halfway point between hardcore home computer classic Starglider and Star Fox on the Super NES. And that's no coincidence or even plagiarism, because it was created by British company Argonaut Software, who, as it turns out, were responsible for the whole lot. Apparently Nintendo saw a demo of this game running and was so impressed they invited Argonaut to work it up into a full game, and ultimately worked with them to create Star Fox and the Super Effects chip. So whilst this game may not be that well known now, it did turn out to be pretty pivotal on the future of Nintendo. Not the only polygonal 3D game on the Game Boy, but unique in a lot of ways, featuring some, for the system, very impressive 3D with massive free-roaming environments. And once again, you've probably guessed it, we're faced with the problem of tile-based graphics, and once again, this is solved in the same way as it was in Faceball, more or less. Although obviously a bit different from that game, it also uses the Game Boy's video RAM as a bitmap display, creating new tiles as they are needed rather than relying on ready-made elements. Yes, we're dealing with wireframe polygons here, but the principle is still the same. You just can't have enough tiles to draw all the lines you need, so the CPU runs code to generate the graphics needed on the fly from 3D models stored in the ROM. This game does seem to run a touch better than Faceball though. We seem to be getting closer to 7 or 8 frames a second, though the screen is still updated in 3 parts, this time from left to right. The increase in speed can probably be explained by the fact that the viewing window is a bit smaller, and the different nature of the graphics means there is less drawing to do and therefore less data to be copied around. Is this something that the NES could do? Well, in this case it's a fairly strong probably, with the aid of extra RAM, and well, it still wouldn't be easy. The very impressive NES port of the classic Elite proves this point, a different game but based around the same sort of thing. Extra RAM in the cartridge helps the NES do what the Game Boy does to make a bitmap display, but as impressive as Elite is, there are fewer polygons on the screen most of the time, and it does look a bit sparse compared to X. And also, no one has ever managed to get Elite running glitch-free on the NTSC NES, the slightly different video timings throwing the whole thing out, so anything more sophisticated than that won't be easy. This also makes me think that something like Faceball would be tough too, though this recent tech demo from FG Software posted on Twitter shows that that could be a possibility, even though it's still quite away from being a fully functional game. For the final act then, it's not Donkey Kong Land, as some of you might have guessed, but I'm going for something less well known, but perhaps more impressive in its own way. It's Prehistorik Man. A late release, this one coming out in 1996, you could easily mistake this for yet another generic platformer, of which of course there was absolutely no shortage of in this era. But both this and the Amstrad CPC original it was converted from are pretty mind-blowing 8-bit limit-pushing amazements done by the Austrian 8-bit wonderworker Elmar Krieger. Or is it Krieger? I don't know, I'm going to have to say this name again in a minute as well. Let's just push on. There really are too many things going on here for me to talk about them all. Loads of effects and twiddly bits in every part of the game, from the title screen to the boss battles to the game over message. It seems like the demo scene was the inspiration for a lot of these effects, sometimes looking, a bit busy, like the Skid Row crack throw somehow ended up in the middle of the game, but never really dull. There's a couple of things that strike me as particularly interesting though, so let's take a look at those. First up, it's this stunning looking parallax effect that appears in quite a few levels. Now this looks for all the world like multi-layer parallax scrolling, the kind of thing that was seen on 16-bit systems like the Mega Drive and Super NES. The paler colour background layer seems to move independently of the foreground, even between those big rocky pillars, and just to really hammer the impressometer, there are even some split screen scrolling effects too, different parts of the screen moving at different rates, and it's all happening in a 4-way scrolling environment. This really shouldn't be possible on the Game Boy. Yes, we have the window layer, but as we've found out before, there is no transparency. You can never see one layer under the other, and well, this can't work the same way that it does in 16-bit land. And yet this is very, very impressive by 8-bit standards, so what on earth is happening? Well, put simply, it is the work of the devil. According to my demonology manual, it's likely that Elmar Krieger, or whatever he's called, summoned Belphegor, one of the 7 princes of hell, and oh well, alright, maybe there is a rational explanation if we look for it. Yeah, maybe not the fruit of arcane rites, but, well, it may be a more sophisticated version of the animated background we saw in Contra. The game is altering those background tiles as the player moves around, basically using a software routine to simulate another layer. It's a repeating pattern. Each one of those rows of background graphics is made of a single tile drawn again and again. To make each row appear to move, only one tile for each row of the screen has to be changed. When the player moves up and down, the point where the background is drawn changes too, adding to the depth effect. This is helped along by the fact that this parallax background is just one pale colour, which reduces the amount of data that needs to be fed into the video memory because of the way the Game Boy stores its graphics data. It also helps it stop being just a blurry mess, because the original Game Boy screen takes longer to switch shades when they are darker, which intensifies the blur. The next thing that can't be ignored is this incredible twin dragon boss fight, the second boss battle, but definitely the most impressive, probably the game's biggest highlight despite being stuck in the middle. This ludicrously difficult and elaborate encounter takes place above the clouds and has the player jumping from dragon to dragon and bashing them on the head, in a sequence that requires a lot of impeccable timing and tight platforming skills. But the question is, how on earth does a Game Boy manage to deal with two such large dragons flying about, popping in and out of the distance in a fairly dizzying display of pixel-flinging madness? Well, put simply, it is the work of the devil. Yes, Elmar Faust made his way to a crossroads at midnight with a black one-eyed rooster and a bottle of bourbon and, well, alright, again perhaps there's a rational explanation if we look. It can't be done with sprites, it would just be a flickery mess. It must be something like the submarine boss we saw in Operation C, where it switches between two separate layers. But that doesn't seem to explain it either. Both dragons can move independently within the same horizontal part of the screen at the same time, so it must be using one background as a window layer, which can be used to add graphics that overlap with the main background. In fact, it's a very complex dance, the two dragons constantly switching between being drawn by the background and the window. The dragon flying around in the sky is drawn by the main background layer, and the one on the bottom is pasted on with the window, but these switch when they both move down to the bottom and one dragon starts to move away. Just to add to the complexity, both dragons are animated separately, and there are two separate dragon sprites, one large and one smaller one used when the dragon is off in the distance. It's all very complicated and brilliantly executed, and frankly it's making my brain overheat just thinking about it, so let's pull back and take a broader view. Could the NES do either of these effects? Well, I'm gonna say it would be a real struggle. Some NES games, Metal Storm for example, did do similar parallax, but they tended to be much simpler patterns and they required extra circuitry in the cartridge to allow the graphics tiles to be manipulated. Some of the more advanced NES enhancement chips might allow the more sophisticated parallax of Prehistorik Man to be done, but well, I've not seen a game that manages it. And what about the crazy boss bonanza? I think that's going to be a pretty firm no. The NES's sprite capabilities weren't much better than the Game Boy's, and it was firmly limited to one background. The only way I think you could do anything like this on the NES would be with some sort of Super Effects style co-processor that could independently process the graphics. I think even the Master System and Game Gear would struggle with it too. Again, I don't think they had any way to handle such large objects. Prehistorik Man is frustratingly close to being a masterpiece, but gameplay wise it just doesn't quite have it. It's a bit short, the controls don't feel quite as tight as they could be, and there's just too many irritating insta-kill moments. It's a shame because this really pushes the hardware to new heights. This technical brilliance combined with something of the joyful platform mayhem of the Donkey Kong Land games could have been an absolute legend. But okay, I'm afraid this has got to be the end. It could easily turn into an epic, but well, I'm gonna sail hard to port and call it a day before my brain starts to run out of my ears and before you get fed up and click on that intriguing looking cheese grater restoration video if you haven't already. There's loads of stuff I've left out, of course, more 3D games, more amazing 2D effects, so your suggestions would be welcome as always, and maybe suggestions of what systems I should cover in future videos too. So thanks for watching, thanks for getting this far, and of course thanks to my extremely generous Patreons, and I'll see you next time folks.